Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to the Forward 50 Channel 4 workshop. I see you there. Ways to control your biggest risks in digital identity. My name is Rob Butler, and I'm an engagement officer, digital disruptor, and GC Digital colleague to many at Shared Services Canada. I'm an Asian male with a white shirt, gray hair, and my home office, and with the Forward 50 screens behind me. Welcome. Welcome to this interactive session. And I say interactive because some of you might be on the GRIP platform. I really want to encourage you to click the link below where it says Zoom. Join the Zoom link on your device, on your computer device, so that you can really interact and engage with this upcoming workshop. It's really important. However, if you don't want to, you can stay on the GRIP platform and watch the stream in English below. Quickly, the code of conduct, please make sure that you keep us safe and this is an inclusive space for all, because this is what Forward 50 is all about. And joined us at hashtag Forward50 on Twitter to be part of the conversation. So I see you there, ways to control your biggest risks in digital identity. With the impact of COVID-19, the need to tackle digital identity is only growing. The ongoing global debates on privacy and data protection are changing opinions on how it should be tackled, including through verifiable credentials. But the conversation is often about technology choices instead of the needs of citizens and the types of services digital identity is required for. So join the discussion focused on considering digital identity from a strategic and service design perspective. We're going to cover questions like, who does digital identity exclude? How do we mitigate against this? How will you prioritize privacy control and convenience? Or do you want to solve this for the world of society, the whole of society, or government services? I'm excited to introduce to you Anna, Stephen, Poe, and Eric. Let's give a Forward 50 warm welcome to our speakers. Over to you, Anna.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rob, for such a really warm welcome. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and joining our call today. I hope that it'll be a really interesting conversation. So let me share my slides. So yeah, as Rob said, today's session is I See You There, Ways to Control Your Biggest Risks in Digital Identity. Just a little bit about all of us who are speaking today. My name's Anna Hirschfeld. I'm a director at Public Digital. And before joining Public Digital last year, I was working within the UK government, most notably 8 years on digital transformation of the UK welfare system, with a particular focus on delivering digital identity for welfare claimants. I'm a specialist in digital strategy and helping leaders set the right conditions for delivery teams to succeed. I'm here with one of my colleagues, Stephen Dunn. Stephen is a consultant with 20 years experience in leading teams building digital products. Stephen was lead product owner for the UK government's digital identity service. And since leaving GDS, Stephen has worked as an independent consultant, including time with the UK Ministry of Justice. And he's currently working with the product teams transforming the UK welfare state in my old world of universal credit. Just a little bit about where we come from. So as I said, I'm a director at Public Digital. Who is Public Digital? Well, we're the picture that you can see on the right-hand side there. That's a very recent photo, the first time we'd actually managed to get together in nearly 2 years. We're a small global consultancy that specializes in digital transformation. We're a small team with a bunch of different skills, whether that's product management, service design, content management, technical architecture, digital transformation, governance and strategy. Lots of different skills, but our main kind of aim and what we all are is we've all worked at the sharp end of digital transformation, and many of us particularly in the public sector. We are also incredibly honoured to have Poe and Eric joining us today for some of the panel elements of today's session. Poe T. Duncan is the Interim Executive Director for Cybersecurity with the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. Poe has 20 years of experience in the federal government, and in 2020 was named as one of the top women in cybersecurity in Canada. Eric is VP of Product Innovation at Convergence.tech. He leads technology development and solution deployment globally. helping to solve problems through the application of new and emerging technologies. He's got a background in public service IT and has advised partners such as the United Nations and various government agencies on how best to adopt new technologies in order to meet their digital ambitions. We will also have some support during the breakout groups from Michael Goit, Director of Digital Identity at Treasury Board. And thank you very much, Michael, for helping out today. So a little bit of background. The inspiration for today's session is really a set of blog posts that Stephen and I have been writing over the last few months based on some research that we've been undertaking to look at different digital identity models around the world, but also our own experience in the UK with big digital identity programs. If you want to go check out our blogs, the first 2 posts are out. The second one, fresh off the presses yesterday on the Public Digital website. And so we're going to use those 6 questions that I'm going to talk about in a little bit later, and hopefully some of yours and some ideas from the panel to kind of develop a discussion of what it means to really be successful at delivering a digital identity service. We'll talk a little bit just now about the 6 questions that we've come up with, but then we really want to get some of your ideas and take a bit of a deeper dive into some of the risks that you need to consider when looking at digital identity. And then we'll be moving into a panel discussion and hopefully towards the end of today, a further breakout sessions to think about kind of solutions and approaches to mitigating some of the risks that lie around the delivery of digital identity. So why did we do this in the first place? I think the kind of classic line at the moment, obviously, is digital identity is everywhere right now. Digital identity and some of those connected concepts and services, such as verifiable credentials, have really been pushed to the fore by COVID. Vaccine passports, the need to remove face-to-face interactions have pushed it to the fore, but also the expectations of our citizens about what can and should be done online has just changed dramatically during COVID. And those expectations mean more and more services may need digital identity to thrive and to be achieved. It's also really a great opportunity. A program to implement digital identity services in your jurisdiction can unlock huge amounts of value, either by replacing costly manual or face-to-face processes, or enabling new services that were just never possible. And because of this, there is a lot of interest, opportunity, noise perhaps around whether digital identity is kind of the right thing for your area. And really, so what we felt that was, as politicians, as public sector leadership, and the world at large pushes jurisdictions of all shapes and sizes to develop digital identity solutions or use existing digital identity solutions, we wanted to just stop for a minute and think about what questions should teams and leaders in government be asking when they get handed this. How do you avoid creating something that maybe doesn't work or excludes people, takes too long to build, isn't adopted? What are the pitfalls for kind of delivering the right service to users? And as Rob mentioned, often this conversation gets very much focused around technology. There's a huge amount of interest, obviously, for lots of very, very good reasons around privacy and personal control of data. And they are incredibly important parts of the mix. And we will absolutely be talking about those today. But there's another side to identity, which I think hasn't been talked about as much, and is something that we really noted in our research was, what does identity mean for those without credit history? Or how do you verify identity when someone's just moved house and changed their name? What does it mean when someone loses their phone and their digital wallet? Our 6 questions are not about technology, but about intent and strategy, needs, and above all, context. So I should say before I get into them that these are 6 questions without answers. Because there isn't one easy, one size fits all answer in digital identity. Context is king. Our aim with this and with this session really is just to help leaders think about the context that they sit in and help find some of those answers in the world that they live in, and the context and the jurisdictions that they are part of. So I'm going to briefly talk through the 6 questions that we used in our blog, but be ready. I won't be talking for too long because I want to get your opinions. So I'm sure there will be many people on the call who are digital identity experts, and we want your thoughts about what can stymie an identity service. What questions would you give to a leader to ask? So listen, but be ready to get your phone out and engage in the next phase. So this almost goes without saying. This is our kind of first question, but it almost goes without saying. Too often, the cart comes before the horse when it comes to digital identity. I'll make this point a few times, but digital identity can exclude people from accessing services they really need. Putting complex ID checks ahead of every online service is not the answer, and also can often skew what is built in the wrong direction. Our second question came around existing or no foundational ID system, really because it changes the nature of the service design challenge. If there's no foundational ID, so no kind of ID card or agreed governmental ID document, you'll need to spend significantly more effort on helping users through the maze of identity verification itself. If you do have a foundational identity, you're not saying that this is going to just be super easy now, but the focus of your service shifts to developing trust in digital identity and understanding what is needed to move users into that online into that online journey, including those who are currently excluded from those existing identity systems. The next question kind of builds on this. In a government context, the services that are most needed often have high numbers of users that are already excluded by society. Requiring users to prove who they are can make accessing a service harder. And actually, identity can create whole new types of excluded groups. And this is something we saw a number of times through our work. A digital identity service is an opportunity to actually improve on what has gone before. And that is something that I think we want all leaders to be thinking about when they're going down this route. Privacy, control, and convenience are something that governments are grappling with at the moment within their own political and policy context around the world. The greater the personal control, the greater the ask on the user. Often, though, when someone is trying to verify their identity, it's at a time of extreme need. So convenience is their focus rather than data privacy. Balancing this need, the user needs versus the kind of overarching goals of privacy and control is something that governments need to grapple with, and teams delivering need to understand. Again, this feels a bit like an obvious point, but we put it in because it's really important not to see identity as a once and done activity. We've seen that missed by teams quite often in the past. So much effort and energy is focused on verifying identity at the beginning of a journey, but trust that your user is who they say they are can degrade over time. Riskier activities like changing bank details can require more trust than you've asked for at the beginning. And having kind of one front door of digital identity alone cannot solve this problem. And I've left this till last, as Stephen will be covering this in the second part of the session today, but the complexity and range of stakeholders that are involved when delivering digital identity service mean that starting simply is really important. And this can bring up questions about service design that we will talk about in much more detail, such as open or closed, private sector or government, centralized or decentralized. So our aim with these questions, as we said at the beginning, is not to provide the one answer to rule them all, but rather start the right conversation with leaders, with stakeholders, and with teams. So with that in mind, I'd like to kick off our first audience participation exercise. So hopefully on the screen in front of you, you can see a link to menti.com. What I would like for people to do is to come up with, are there any other questions that leaders who are kind of taking on the challenge of building or utilizing existing digital identity solutions, what questions should they be asking about the way that their service design is put together? So you can either go to menti.com and use the code that's shown above, or you can use the QR code, as we are now all becoming very, very QR friendly. So I'm just going to move across to Menti and hopefully give you a chance to come up with some ideas of what other questions should leaders be asking around digital identity. So what is the impact if the digital identity is compromised? That's a great question. Why are we even doing this? I think there's a really important kind of, should we go down this route? And I think that's what we were kind of asking at the beginning is, do you even need identity? How do we establish trust among citizens? How do we establish trust among citizens that their identity would be protected and only used for accessing services? I think that's a great question. I think trust and what people expect from my digital identity is a real challenge. Where's their data stored? How citizens can easily leverage the system without permission from us, just like the original identity system we evolved. Interesting. How do you protect individuals' privacy and freedom? How do we avoid I can't say that word. How do we avoid a proliferation of competing systems? That's a really good and interesting question. And a challenge that we've definitely seen in the UK with different identity systems existing at the same time. Who has access to the data and how are permissions established? These are fantastic questions. This is great. What I'm going to do now is just ask the panel members. So Eric, Stephen, Poe, could you unmute and join me in the call?
Hello, everyone.
Hey, everyone.
Hi. So we've got some great questions coming through. I'm going to come back to some of these in a minute. Poe or Eric, obviously me and Stephen wrote these 6 questions. Are there any that you would add in specifically?
I mean, I think it's a good sort of coverage of a lot of the broad basis, and it hits out a lot of the underlying topics too that we're kind of seeing come up. And the one I do like is the whole idea of, do we even need an identity? Because that one brings up a whole lot of interesting ideas, I think, with regards to how identity really works in the real world, right?
Yeah.
Where it's more about the claim than it is about the identity and the identifier. And that's a sort of interesting conversation path to go down to.
I would say that there's definitely excellent questions here as well. I think, the whole digital identity, I think for me, it's like, well, ask Canadians. We know right now Canadians are accessing systems individually, separately to each government program. So that makes it less convenient for the user as well. So how do we balance the user needs, making sure that we know who you say you are before you access government online services? So what's the balanced approach while we're managing risks? And of course, making sure that the information is secure and building trust in our services. So I think a lot of these questions relate to that. And, we've seen the need, as you mentioned, Anna, earlier, in terms of, I would say digital government acceleration in light of COVID. And so, wouldn't it have been great to be able to bind that digital identity to a verifiable credential as well, right? To really increase the assurance of that, that digital credential, the digital identity. So there's lots of great questions here that we can certainly tackle along the way.
Stephen, is there anything that's jumping out at you from a...
Yeah, I think there's something interesting about this question that's on the screen now. What might different tiers or levels of identity verification look like? I think something I've learned from experience is that you want to only ask for the information or verify to the level that you need. But in practice, if you want to actually share identity across multiple services, it can get quite fine-grained. Like one service, they may both want the same level of assurance, but when you get to the question of will people verified by one service be trusted by another, things get kind of quite tricky, and everybody wants their own little tweak on that. Something else, Anna, I was just thinking, someone's asked, can we share the link? Is it possible to share the link to that screen so that participants in Zoom can, I don't know if it's possible to do that. So maybe put it in the Zoom chat.
Yeah, if you go to menti.com and put in the code, hang on, I'm just putting it into the chat because I can still see it, which is helpful. There we go. So yeah, if you go to menti.com and here's the code.
And just to carry on from that idea, Stephen, the whole idea of different levels of assurance allowing you access to different information attributes, I think is another interesting one, because while new technology and cryptography and everything can do fun things around selective disclosure and the like, I think the best way to still protect information is to not necessarily collect it at all. And I think you can get into that situation on the context of how is this identity or how is this credential going to be used. If it's for low assurance, minimize the data. If it's for high assurance, only then do you start looking at parceling the data is I think one of those elements that people need to start thinking about as they shift the identity systems to digital, recognizing we're not in a world of paper sign-up forms anymore, where you just need to throw down all of your personal information for everything. And it's really about the context of how it's going to be used.
Absolutely. The one that keeps coming back into my head is, how do we avoid a proliferation of competing systems? I think that's a real challenge, and is a strange, yeah, you would think with digital identity, it's often a government-led thing, you only need one, but in reality, digital identity often seems to become, there's many different choices. Po, I don't know if that's a challenge you've seen in from your perspective.
Certainly, and for us, having a centralized approach or a federated approach really goes a long way. Within the government of Canada, and work closely with our provinces and territories, who really are they have the authoritative source of digital identity information. So we want to leverage the great work that they're doing. Like, for example, Alberta, BC, they've done a lot of great work in establishing digital identity, and we want to leverage those to access government online services. And we've tested that with our partners at Service Canada, as well as the Canada Revenue Agency. So there's definitely lots of benefits, but that's a different model within Canada with that pan-Canadian federated model. I think within the GC itself, the government itself, there's lots of users or programs who want to roll their own authentication. And I think it goes a long way when we have our own sort of a simplified centralized approach to really facilitate access, have more eyes on that one system versus bespoke systems that are being used across the GC, which then, investments are being made for the same thing versus having a centralized approach that can benefit all. And then departments can really focus on their core mandates, really focus on the fraud detection within their own programs. So I think for me, having a centralized approach, centralized program within the government of Canada would really go a long way.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely, it's certainly been in the past a challenge in the UK, I would say, having sort of verify. There was another system that's similar in terms of identity verification. And I know Stephen's going to talk a bit more about kind of supply and demand in terms of moving people onto digital identity. But the challenge when you have multiple systems that perhaps have different sort of life expectancies or expectations of how wide they're going to be used, it creates a real challenge of moving things on and getting to that one solution. And similarly, that issue of if you don't really need identity, but everyone's sticking it on the front of their service, how often does that create lots of competing identity systems, which I've certainly seen in the past.
And I would say, just chiming in from sort of the technology side of things here too, I mean, I think it is complicated to try and make these sort of systems scale cross jurisdiction. And that's one of those things that does need to be grounded in technical standards, which there's a lot of good ambitions out there right now with regards to what's going on. I know OpenID Connect is pretty well-rounded in terms of its adoption. In that sense, some of the newer stuff around what's happening with W3C, verifiable credentials, and those sorts of things, those are all great. Those are all high-level ambitions right now, because once it gets down to the tech and the protocols, it's a lot more complicated. But I think what's changing now as people's concept of digital identity matures, and this whole idea of, I guess, agency or control over your own data, I think it is starting to drive people to look beyond their borders in terms of how can we create these ecosystems that actually work cross jurisdiction, because I think that's the biggest risk for broad adoption of usable, easy to use digital identity, is the fact that we just end up with a whole bunch of walled gardens and silos, because we have a system for government ID, we have a system for private ID, we have a system for banking ID, and unless it all sort of talks together, the user just sort of misses out. And we can't make this complicated, because that's exactly why bad password hygiene is such a thing. The only reason people are so messy with passwords is because we've all made it too hard with rules and roles and all kinds of different things like that, changing passwords. So people just end up misusing it because it's too complicated. And we can't go down the path of this being too complicated and people having to manage like 10 different identity wallets, 10 different identity systems going forward. So really, I think drives us towards trying to simplify things and look at what standards can allow for kind of cross-jurisdiction exchange of this information. Easier said than done, knowing that the trust framework problem to back it all up on, is my onboarding the same as your onboarding? That's a big question, but that's a question that needs to be tackled really if we ever want the model to be more inclusive than just sort of through a central provider, a central service doing it all. And looking at global interoperability, I think that's definitely a conversation still to come.
Yeah.
I was going to say, Anna, there's something came up that really interested me in the questions. There's been a few things talking about, is there a kind of more future forward-looking version of identity that we could be looking for, rather than just being about personal characteristics, which is quite interesting. I think there's been a few questions like that. One of something that I've encountered in my experience is that there's a lot of exciting things you can do there, but the needs of government services are quite often around matching data in legacy systems, which, as you said, Eric, were sort of built around asking lots of personal data. So even though you'd like to build something that didn't need so much, in reality, the service need is, how do I match these people to my big legacy system where they're already using these services, they're just not using them online. And actually what you've really got is a sort of trusted matching problem rather than an identity problem. And so you get sucked back into having to do everything based on personal characteristics, because that's the only thing you've got leverage to match with. You can't sort of start from the ground. You can't bootstrap your way up because you've already got this big legacy data you've got to match to. I don't know if that's something you're familiar with, Eric and Ho.
Yeah, I mean, in principle, I guess it is sort of worth thinking how that might change things. And it is looking at identity differently, to be about the claims being made and their provenance, as opposed to the identifiers. But that's a big shift, right? Because our world, machine learning, AI, that's based on like correlatable data. So it runs a lot of the world. It does a lot of good things for us. If we now go down the path of saying, okay, privacy protection, user first, non-correlatable data, yeah, we've got some serious gaps in terms of how we actually manage and use information that all of us have kind of collected, which is not to say good thing, bad thing. It's just to say that's definitely a challenge going forward in terms of what's the incentive to shift towards some of these more non-correlatable privacy protecting models, and does it sort of have enough momentum behind it to overcome some of these limitations?
And definitely from the perspective of using the legacy systems for that data, I mean, some of those systems may have been already compromised, right? So is it, do we want to continue using SIN for, identity validation, or should we be looking at other claims to make, or attributes to make sure that you are who you say you are, and maybe looking at other sources. So I don't think it's one source that we should be looking at. Maybe it's the multiple sources that we look at, and then it's the risk score that you get from validating if it is that person, right? So I think there's definitely ways we can look at different options to identify a person, but also if within the government of Canada we think of things separately from identity assurance and then credential assurance, right? So identity assurance, making sure you have the right person; credential assurance, making sure it is the same person, and then for those high value assets, really making sure that it is that real person. So we do a lot of work in making sure that the tools are there for departments to make sure you understand the program, the impacts of the program, and having the right authentication requirements. And then, for us, hopefully having a centralized service to enable and facilitate access to those programs, and do that once. And then really, again, going back to, program, really it's the departments who really own the program. So they need to really focus on making sure, matching the identity to the person in the back end as well, using different sources. So I think there's lots of elements. It's the layers of defense that we have to think about. Absolutely.
Which feels like a nice segue actually into our next phase in terms of what that means from a delivery perspective. So what I was going to suggest is we're going to move on to part 2, which is kind of talking a little bit more into the deep depths, into the depth of kind of what are the risks around digital identity for delivery. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. And thank you everybody for your input into the Menti. Rob, something that I didn't really think about before, but we should probably think of a way of sharing that somehow afterwards. There's some really, really good questions in there. So yeah, I will make sure that we capture that and share it through Forward 50 somehow. So yeah, just a thing to remember. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Stephen, who's going to talk a little bit more about the thinking that he's been doing on risks around delivery of digital identity.
Okay, great. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. So yeah, we're talking here about, as we've seen, and I think Anna mentioned already, programs that implement digital identity can unlock a tremendous amount of value. There's a lot of statistics out there, very easy to find. For example, in my home country, the UK, recently some research has been done. I think the director of digital identity, Hannah Rutter, said that over 800 million British pounds could be saved a year by businesses across the UK by solving this problem. So I think it's one of the questions that we posed in Anna's set was, how can you control the risk of failing to deliver that value? Either whether it's for public or private services or both, in the situation where you're delivering it for public services, but you have the aim of extending that into the private sector as well. So, and what we started looking at, what are some of the risks that digital identity programs in government may encounter, and then what are some of the strategies that have been used to control them. So I'll talk first about some risks and then some controls. If you're very familiar with digital identity programs, then much of this may be familiar to you already, and we can move on to have a discussion about this afterwards. So I think the first one really is that it can actually take a long time to agree between many parties. There are large numbers of users, public services, identity and attribute verification services in any identity system, and they've all got different needs and requirements. So creating something that works for users and meets the needs of a wide variety of the services, it's not a simple undertaking. It can take many years to reach agreement. For example, something you're probably all familiar with, DIAC in Canada, the trust framework, it's been underway for about 4 to 6 years, carefully working to produce something very comprehensive that covers standards across all sectors. Now, the great news is that this work can now be leveraged, but it does take a lot of time to get there. Another example, in Australia, they started their work to create a trust framework back in 2015. And this year, they've just accredited the very first private sector organization to be an identity exchange operator. The next thing, I guess, that's kind of a risk is that just understanding growing a services market is hard. So quite often in identity programs, you're kind of in the middle of a supply-demand gap in a marketplace. You're trying to persuade users to use the identity service and service providers to join the ecosystem, rather than use existing or alternative services. And this can happen whether your service is centralized, federated, or even decentralized. Without sufficiently attractive services that can be used, the case for signing up may not be clear to citizens. There's been some quite clear cases made now with COVID, but without sufficient volumes of verified users, your services, the service teams that are building those public services, they may not see the value in the identity service. They may wait for growth. And without sufficient uptake, the new services, they might not want to invest the time to actually make their services truly self-service. It can be harder to justify that. So things take longer. So for example, New Zealand have got the Real Me verified identity system. After 6 years, they had only 20% of what they originally forecasted in terms of the uptake. My experience in the UK, GovUK Verify, in the first 6 years of operation, there were 8 million people verified, but originally we forecast that there would be 25 million verified, and only 22 services were signed up in the first 6 years. Another example, maybe closer to some people here, British Columbia, very successful, the BC Services Identity Card. I think it's 4.7 million cards issued, maybe more than that, over a population of 5 million. But the mobile services card more recently released, only about 30 out of hundreds of services have onboarded to use that. So there's still a great untapped potential. It's just going to take a time to grow these marketplaces. Another thing that's a big risk is you may underestimate the effort and cost of ensuring that your identity service doesn't exclude anybody. Digital exclusion is very commonplace, but there's an intersection between those excluded from digital services and people who find it difficult to prove their identity, particularly online. And particularly as more evidence that's traditionally used to verify identity, for example, in the UK, people are using things like bank statements, letters, things like that. All that stuff's moving online. More people will be excluded. So you often have to create support mechanisms, face-to-face via video or telephony. And the risk here is that you may underestimate the effort and cost of providing these services. If you start out not thinking about this, you're eventually going to have to work out how to do this. The next risk is around complexity and control. And I think we can have a very good discussion about this. Identity is complex. A good service is going to keep things simple for users and hide that complexity. But there are tensions here. Principles dictate that users should be in control, so you need to provide controls. But you don't want to overwhelm users with choice or repeated requests for consent, and it may limit your ability to usefully share data in support of what users need. It might not be always obvious who users should call when there's a problem. So there's a risk here you might fail to understand where your users want to be on that spectrum from being in total control to having the convenience of having someone look after it for them. So there's a few risks. I'll briefly go through a few controls as well. And they're really all about controlling the amount of complexity in what you're building while you're learning how to make it work for all users. I would say, first of all, we'd recommend that you use internet era ways of working. I'm not going to go through this here, but you're probably familiar with a lot of government service standards, such as design for user needs rather than convenience to the organization. We've compiled a list of here in our organization, Public Digital. I've put the URL there up on the screen if you're interested. But there are several things that identity programs have done in particular that help with the risks I've discussed. So the first thing we found is start with a smaller ecosystem. So limit the size of the ecosystem. So for example, in Australia, they've chose to solve the problems within the government first and build success there before attempting to involve the private sector. And likewise, the Scottish government are taking even smaller steps. They're starting by reusing trusted data between services using existing relationships. So if one public sector organization trusts you to do a particular attribute, that attribute could be used in another public sector organization. And they want to build success there before tackling private sector opportunities, before actually doing standalone identity verification. It's a very interesting project. Another strategy is to start with a simpler user journey and build and scale as you learn. So an obvious thing is to start by offering a strong digital credential first, using that, and then adding identity verification later on. So login.gov in the US, quite successful now, started initially with the aim of doing identity verification, but their first release was with an authentication service. And likewise, the UK government, in their follow-up to gov.uk Verify, have started with a single login program whilst they learn about identity verification. Another tactic that we've seen is, well, you need to work on both supply and demand side. So yes, you design for the needs of users first, and then you follow on to design for organizational convenience. But the only way of getting a good user experience is to work closely with those services. So that makes, making it really easy for services to technically integrate, work in the open, provide clear documentation, sandboxes and examples, make it bureaucratically simple, eliminate procurement and setup costs. So, try and not to land people with a setup fee to actually onboard, and try and eliminate complex procurement processes. That's a service you can deliver. And then finally, pool user research about how and where to use identity in your service, so that services understand about how they should best use that for the needs of users. By the way, a lot of this stuff that we've got a little bit more detail and some links in our blog post if you want to find that. I've provided links to some of these strategies. Build and community, very important. There's no substitute for direct research with users, but successful approaches tend to involve a lot of intense work with stakeholders. So you'll be engaging with privacy stakeholders, industry associations. In the UK, we've got the Open Identity Exchange, who are pioneering a lot of the research that's actually influencing some of the work in inclusion in identity, for example. And of course, a common approach is to use the generation of a trust framework as a focus for conversation. So it allows you to discuss and agree what's important to you, potentially agnostic of technology or vendor. And this is what's been used at scale. Obviously, you do discuss technology within trust frameworks, but you can discuss other things as well. So this is now being used very successful, obviously in Canada, but also Australia, the UK, and Europe. And I think lastly, I think this is something that's really important in any kind of product development. Put yourself in the position where you can test your risky assumptions with users as early as possible. So that might mean organizing your program so that the things you're least certain about are in the position where you're most easily able to learn and change. So, for example, if there's something, you go through an exercise, what are our riskiest assumptions? And make sure those are in the hands of teams that are close to you, that are agile, that are able to learn and adapt quickly. So, potentially controversially at the time, the General Services Administration in the US, when they built login.gov in-house at the time, was quite controversial because it kind of took it away from a public-private sector partnership, but it allowed them to actually closely control and iterate the whole user experience, making it great for users, which was some of the challenges with the previous federation. Maybe it helped them with that. So I'm hoping that that sort of set of risks and questions is giving us something useful to think and discuss. And I think I'm going to hand back now to Anna, who can take us to a panel discussion. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Stephen. So the question to the panel, and we might hand this out for some questions as well, is, and obviously probably Eric or Poe, maybe Poe first. I mean, what do you think, kind of listening to that, some of that I'm sure chimes, some of that is probably less relevant in Canada, but what do you think the biggest risks for identity projects in Canada are right now?
I think the biggest risk is the risk of inaction. So I think we've seen a lot of movement. We've actually, we were the brainchild of the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework even before DIAC embarked on that journey. So I do, look at some of my key folks, Tim Buma, who's not here today, really being the thought leader in digital identity and really establishing that foundational framework. We turned that into the standards, right? So the CIO Strategy Council of Canada has a new standard based on that framework, and then really making sure that we, stay grounded in that framework as we enable interoperability across both within the private sector as well as the public sector. I think Eric had mentioned earlier about interoperability. I think it's not just about interoperability within Canada, but also around the world, right? So we see, do we develop an international vaccine passport, or do we brand the provincial ones and leverage those? right? So I think it's a little bit different in the context of the government of Canada, where we have provinces and territories, and then we have the federal department. So it's a matter of how do we work together to facilitate access to digital identity, credentials. I do think that having an iterative approach does really go a long way. So we have done a lot of work with digital credentials in terms of, using a password, but also trying to layer in additional protection measures. But being mindful of not excluding folks, right? So when we embarked on the journey of implementing multi-factor authentication, for us, it was a challenge. Like, we still need to have multi-channel options, right? There is a generation gap, or at least, my parents don't necessarily use smartphones. So how are they going to receive that text message? So we need to make sure that those service centers are still available to support the different populations and those without technology in Canada. So there's definitely lots of challenges and risks, but I think if we focus on, having a strong foundation from a policy perspective, thinking about the user first from a people perspective, and making sure from a security or a technology perspective, we're building in the layers of defense. It's not just about what you see on the surface, but also the layers underneath from the infrastructure side as well. So lots of risks.
Yeah, and I mean, to carry on from that, I would agree. It's all about the user experience in this case. We have the chance to do something great. We have the chance to fix identity on the internet. It's not going to work or go anywhere if we don't make it easy. And that's, I guess, the biggest challenge about things like digital identity and authentication, is that's just a barrier for most people 99% of the time to getting to what they want. So the more you can stay out of the way, the more you can kind of bake in the security and hide it behind the user experience, the simpler you can make it, the better our chance at actual adoption on all of this kind of stuff. Because for sure, the inclusion problem, and we do work in like decentralized identity and some of the future forward things like that. Just because you can do things like have your own private keys or manage your own data, or you're given that kind of responsibility or authority, two things. One is the open question on, is that appropriate for all situations, or are broker models, trust models still going to exist? And I think looking forward, they still are in some capacity. It's absolutely right for some users to have the option to manage things themselves, but not necessarily the capability to, and delegate that out. And then I think the other angle here is really just kind of looking again at the whole curse of digital identity and cryptography, and that whole ecosystem is some of this stuff gets pretty complicated. And being able to explain it to people, why it's different, how they're being empowered, is a big challenge, because practically speaking, most people don't care. They're just trying to use a service. They're just trying to access a service. And part of, I guess, what we do, especially when we get into sort of the complex stuff like zero knowledge proof, selective disclosure, all that fun technical stuff, part of it feels like most days we're just building a glorified consent checkbox, and no one really cares how it works. And then once they say, yep, it's good, take all my data, as long as you've done your due diligence to say, well, I gave you the choice, we kind of lose plot of what happens after that. And I think that's actually where the bigger risk is. And a lot of these identity systems is a lot of it is sort of focused on gaining the credential, owning your data, getting consent and presenting that data. There's little discussion, I guess, on what happens on the verification or relying party side to say, once you've given me that data, what kind of accountability am I under for managing it, or being responsible for it, or not storing it? And I think that's a big part of the conversation too. Making it easy, and then just once we empower people, how do we actually treat the data responsibly? Just because it's being presented from someone else doesn't make that whole problem go away.
Absolutely. We've got a good question actually in the chat, which follows on from that. Has the web of trust, this is from Daniel Obst, and apologies if I pronounced your name wrong, but has the web of trust changed since COVID and the pandemic? Do you feel like users have a different expectation around identity and using services that require that kind of level of consent?
Interesting. Well, I can say a lot more people know what a QR code is, for better or worse. I personally hope a QR code is a temporary showing in digital identity, and that's going to be gone soon. But I mean, hey, it's what we have right now. There's that. As far as how it impacts trust, I mean, yeah, I guess that's an open question. I would say a lot of people are exposed to more digital identity, more remote technologies, asking these kind of questions that they didn't have in person, and now they do remotely on, can I trust this service? Can I trust this person? I don't know if anyone else has any sort of thoughts on how this might have changed globally.
for me, I think bad actors are taking advantage of, some of this work, some of the stuff, right? So, yes, QR codes are great, but, some QRs aren't that good, right? So how do we make sure that, that QR isn't sending you to a malicious website, right? So yes, I think that sometimes, well, we didn't have a choice. We had to work virtually from home. So how do we make sure we balance, the user needs, making sure that for us, like users, were still able to access the network, right? But then access the right tools. But then just making sure that from, last month was Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So, making sure you're mindful, just think before you click that link, right? So I think that has to happen every day, even in the context of digital identity and how we're using our services. So not trying to scare everybody, but I think that it's just being mindful, I think, goes a long way.
It's a really good point. It's a massively good point. It's definitely something we've seen in the UK as well, is fraud's just taking the opportunity whilst things are in flux and are not quite how they were before. And some of those face-to-face processes that sort of bolstered what we were doing online have now gone. And that's definitely a space where you can see that happening. Stephen, sorry, I don't know if you.
I thought your comment, Eric, about the trust isn't just in the identity system is really interesting, because I remember when we were initially looking at privacy, like the previous iteration, or rather current iteration of identity verification, the UK came off the back of a very intense focus on privacy from a previous kind of national ID scheme that was quite controversial at the time. So a lot of the design focused on privacy protections, the idea of the federation. There was sort of double blind federation hub that meant different parties couldn't see each other. And that actually kind of very successfully kind of reassured some stakeholders, but made it difficult for users, because it meant that it was a longer journey, and information that could have helped users who were less confident couldn't be passed through the federation, rightfully according to the principles, but it created problems. And I remember someone sort of pointing out that, just as you said, like, have we kind of created a Maginot line, in that, that kind of analogy from, I think, the First World War, where you've got this line where the data doesn't travel, like the identity system is secure, but behind the scenes, once you've matched to your service, the services are talking to each other, who knows what they're doing. And I remember at the time, we were spending quite a lot of time trying to think about what we as an identity service should put into a memorandum of understanding, or what agreements should the identity service have with the relying parties as to what they were and were not allowed to do with the data. And where did that dividing line end? Like, whose right was it to say? At what point could you say, the user's handed this data over, look after it? How much influence can you have? And I guess having a trust framework kind of reassures people a bit more, but there are limits to what you can do. And I guess maybe that means that your trust framework needs to cover not just the process of identity verification, but something more about how data is used and shared more widely. Perhaps, in the UK and the EU, we've got the GDPR legislation, which kind of provides that additional trust. If you don't have that in your jurisdiction, that might mean you need to look into that a bit more. I'm not sure how it is in Canada with that, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it comes back to the raising awareness thing, right? In terms of, there's a lot of good intentions out there, Pan-Canadian Trust Framework, DIAC doing great work in terms of furthering some of this thinking as well. But having that connect with the average citizen is that sort of responsibility, I guess, we have, broadly speaking, and public service has a great opportunity to do that, obviously, being sort of that trust anchor and purveyor of a lot of sort of digital information and claims, to be able to explain to people how this is different and how to trust it. But it's those subtleties that people need to understand, right? Because I think one of the common concerns with adoption of things like government branded technology is people's usually unfounded fears that it's surveillance. It's, well, it's not that you didn't ask me for the data. It's that now that you have the data, who knows what you're going to do with it. So it's kind of one of those things on how do you balance public perception of how some pretty complicated technology works, or some pretty subtle data sharing frameworks work, with the whole, just how does that land to your average person? And I think that's the next thing that really sort of needs to be thought about if we want to see increased adoption with some of this stuff.
Well, certainly from the public service perspective, the government of Canada takes privacy and security seriously. So anytime there's an application or service that is launched, there's definitely a privacy impact assessment that's done, especially if there's personal information. And we do encourage, don't, like if you don't need to collect that information, don't. All right, so then we don't possess that. And I think it goes a long way when we can share, tell us once the information, and then from a secure means, through APIs, etc. You share that information. But I mean, that's more complex than it sounds, because there's definitely authorities, legislation, etc. that goes along with that. And that's part of our journey as well. Like, how do we navigate this, make it easier for the citizen, but also make sure that we're protecting information as well within our systems. So I do want to also highlight that, yes, the trust framework is there, but it is about that ongoing monitoring, ongoing assurance as well, right? Like, as you mentioned, Eric, it's not just assess once, but it's how do you maintain that system on a continuous basis, and having those information sharing agreements, and and then making sure you have plans. Like, if there's something bad happens, like, you need to be ready, and we need to be able to mitigate and respond, right? So that's the cyber side of me. But in terms of just being prepared, but if we can, only collect what we need, and make sure that we're open and transparent about it. We have personal information banks that are shared on our Canada.ca site, so we do take those components, and we want to build trust in our services so Canadians will use them.
Yeah. I think the ethereal, how do we get trust, is such a difficult question to answer. And I found it particularly interesting in the UK, was a sort of a double-edged sword of it, of that people, as you said, Eric, there's that slight concern of, what are you doing with my data now you've got it? I don't want to give it to you. I'm not sure about this. And then actually, when you ask people to use services, they go, well, you already know all of this about me because some part of government has this. Why don't you just use it? And the fact that government doesn't always know everything about you, or this particular part of government doesn't always know everything about you, is a bit of a shock. And then, but at the same time, there's a challenge around sharing of data. And I think there's a real, and I think that's what we're kind of particularly focusing on with that point of balancing convenience against privacy and control, is you are constantly hitting that in even the personal response of people. When you ask them user research about privacy and data and identity, you will often get a different response than if you're asking them about how they want to access their employment history or their tax history, because those are different parts of their sort of personality almost. And I think that's a real challenge of, how do we get that I just want to do the thing I want to do, balanced with their own sort of philosophical point of, I don't want government to have to know everything about me or have everything about me. It's a real challenge.
It's an interesting balance, and maybe it does come back down to the level of assurance, and recognizing that most digital identities are used in low assurance situations, just to access something, access a service, whatever it might be. Being able to have a different user experience, I think that kind of ramps up with the amount of trust required, is potentially the way to make this all easier. Because I mean, yeah, this is all about trust. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need any of this because we trust everybody. We can't do that, so we look for anchors. Government's a pretty good anchor in most countries. Most people will trust their government, not all, certainly. And that's one shortcut to being able to say, okay, who are these trust anchors that can kind of make these claims? But then, yeah, it does open the question up to, are people mature enough to be able to create their own sort of trust frameworks and assessments on, okay, well, I don't need someone to tell me I can trust this. I can trust this based on my education, based on my information, based on my own personal opinion. And I think that's where it gets different. And that's where, I guess, coming back to the COVID complexity, it's a good example that I'm not sure we've actually cracked yet, is how do we trust medical systems cross country to trust vaccine certificates? Where it's easy when you go through a central body, federated body, to say, hey, yeah, this is down to a standard from the World Health Organization or ICAO or whatever it is. But what's behind that is still someone putting themselves on the line and saying, yeah, I trust the healthcare system here. And if you really think about it, then you have to agree with their assessment before you can trust them saying, yep, this is good to go. And I think that really just opens up the complexity of sort of the web of trusts that exist globally, and how complex just digital identity actually is when you start looking at it holistically instead of just in a sort of a service angle. But
so we're getting some good questions, but I'm thinking time-wise, it might be worth starting to break out into breakout groups, because I think it's probably worth delving into it, and we're starting to get a few more questions coming through. So if I can just go back to sharing my screen. So we have some breakout rooms. And I think we've started to talk about some of these issues, and trust seems to be definitely one of the key ones. So we have 5 breakout rooms for the audience to have some time to have a bit of a conversation, a bit of debate, and come up with some potentially think about solutions and approaches to some of the questions that we're coming up with. One of the panel members will be in each room, along with Michael Goit, who has very kindly offered to facilitate one of the breakout rooms. We've got about 10 to 15 minutes in the rooms, and then we'll come back together again. In a minute, I will bring up the choices of rooms. You'll be able to choose a room when they come up. If you want to move rooms, law of 2 feet, you can do so. And go somewhere else if it's more exciting. We're going to keep one of the breakout rooms in the main room. So if you want to stay for what are the biggest risks in your identity program, which is Poe is going to be leading on. That was right. Yeah, I'm making sure I've got those right. And then is staying in here. If you want to go to talk about preventing exclusion of citizens, I'm going to be leading that group, and that's going to be in group 1 in room 1. Room 2 will be prioritizing privacy, control, and convenience, which is with Eric. Group 3 will be looking about how do you encourage services to use digital ID, which is group 3. And group 4, which is going to be Michael, is how do we establish trust among citizens. So we've already kind of really started to kick off that conversation. So it feels like that Michael, I might have just given you the busiest room. So apologies. So yeah, I'm just gonna open the breakout rooms. So hopefully everyone can see them now. You should have seen a little red dot come up in the corner of your down on the toolbar for Zoom. And then you should be able to pick a room. Obviously, if you want to stay in here to talk about biggest risks on your identity program, then please stay here. If you'd like to choose one of the other rooms, then do so. Just to say, I'm gonna share this screen in all the breakout rooms so that you can also see the question that we asked in the breakout rooms. As well for me, because I don't want to forget. Okay. I can see people starting to move to the rooms. Leaders, do you want to head to your rooms?
I'm going to head in.
Sure.
And I will broadcast a message when we've got about 2 minutes beforehand.
Just say, as we all come back in this main room, if you could turn your cameras off, just because you'll be on the stream. And we have about, I guess, about 10 minutes left.
Yeah,
Anna.
Great. So I'm just, yeah, I guess as people come back, I think we've probably got most people now, which is great. I was just going to go around the room leaders and just ask really quickly for kind of 1 or 2 points that have come out of the conversation that you've been having. Poe, anything particularly stand out for you?
I think for us is mostly about exclusion in general. I know that it was one of the other breakout questions, but it is also a risk, excluding folks, and just looking at different options in terms of, VAC, for example, establish partnerships with Service Canada to have another option for some of the citizens. making sure that we are developing services that aren't, so locked down that they're not usable. Making sure we're not asking for MFA 47 times over when we're accessing a service. And mostly as well, it's great that we're talking about creating digital identity, but what do we do when it's compromised and there's a fraud aspect, and how do you protect that? So how do you recover from fraud with digital identity? So that's the key points from the breakout session.
That's a really good question. It's one that, I feel as we get into the verifiable credentials world becomes even, more complicated. And actually, I'll go next because, we were talking about exclusion, and multi-factor authentication came up for us as well. And actually talked about a little bit about the trade-offs of how secure or to what level do you want to do to, as you said, lock down that service versus ensuring that the right people can get into it. And there definitely felt like sometimes it's trying to find that right trade-off between what's the, how do you manage the risk in a way that's appropriate but can get the right number of people in. Do you go for text or do you go for multi-factor if most of the people on your service don't have smartphones or don't always have access to smartphones with data? So that was one of the things that came up in ours. Another one was around thinking about where does digital identity come in the journey of the service, so that it isn't a barrier when people are just first kind of making that it isn't a barrier to the most important point, if you can be. So the example that I was talking about was universal credit, with only asking for identity verification once a claim's submitted. So you got your date of claim, you're going to get paid, hopefully, but now we know when you're going to get paid. So that was the two that we talked about a little bit. Eric, anything exciting in the world of privacy, control, and convenience?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess it is trending towards, again, that whole idea of convenience. This is not going to take off, even if you give someone the choice to do something in a different way. Unless they see the value, unless they see the benefit, they're probably not going to do it. So convenience is sort of paramount here. But then also that means sort of there's some responsibility, I think, to respect privacy when you're designing these systems. Privacy by design, privacy by default. Recognizing that there's, I suppose, contextual elements and cultural elements to privacy and how people sort of see themselves in their data. That needs to be baked in with some of these principles around sort of the bare minimum of data is the good approach. Don't collect it unless you need it. Don't share it unless you need it. Think about that on a transaction by transaction basis. And that's where a lot of these identity systems and sort of new ways of thinking start to make a lot more sense, but recognizing that has to still be convenient and not almost automatic. And then I think one of the barriers that just quickly came up in discussion there too is our legislation and are our laws actually ready for this kind of stuff? Because a lot of this, in terms of the Privacy Act and a lot of protections that were put in place in and around collecting data and intent of its usage, worked great in the 80s and the 90s previously when we didn't have digital integrated systems. But we've since moved to a world where so many other services, so many other sort of applications and things we rely on now rely on consistent data sharing and seamless experiences. So what kind of harmonization or modernization needs to happen on the legislative front to actually enable this kind of stuff, which would be the opportunity to actually increasing the user experience and making it easier. So it's kind of as part of this digital transformation with digital identity, bringing in these new things. How can you enable that through legislation so we don't have to have a whole bunch of hacky workarounds to actually sort of meet the letter of the law and still sort of provide good public service?
Oh, you're nodding lots there. I feel like that.
That's encouraging as a Canadian.
Yeah. I feel like I want to talk about that a lot more. But we should carry on. And Stephen, anything to talk about from kind of encouraging services to start using digital ID?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, the group we're in, obviously, looking at jurisdictions, looking over the fence at jurisdictions where they seem to have had some success. So looking at BC, Alberta, to try and understand what they've done. I think couple of interesting things came out. One is, how do you actually make it compelling for citizens? It's when you see the cross-sharing work that it seems to make sense. So I could draw an example. In the UK, everybody loves the fact that when you renew your driving license, they take the photograph from the passport office, and citizens in the UK know that those are two different agencies, and it seems like magic. You've done that. And it's those sort of things that people kind of see the value, even though they shouldn't care about it being different organizations. It does kind of do that. And another thing, actually, going back to one of our other points about you don't always need digital identity. Sometimes actually information can't be shared, not because of privacy, but because there's some kind of policy. And we had an interesting chat about some information that is actually already out there in public, but policy prevents it from being shared. So unfortunately, we didn't have time to go into that, but it's kind of an interesting thing. And lastly, how do we make this work? It's like, which department should own and lead this is a key choice. Picking the right, federally or wherever, choosing who to own that might be right. Or if there isn't a right choice, creating that federation of people so there's a sort of shared ownership.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think I feel like I really want to add that one in, of like, who owns this? Where does this sit in the organization? That's a really good question. And then Michael, establishing trust among citizens. Any kind of key points you want to bring out?
Yeah, I mean, the group had an interesting chat around explainability of these systems, how the language we use and the way we describe digital ID really impacts the mental model that people have of it. And, having something explainable, having the systems be open and transparent, and really communicating with people where they're at was the crux of what we talked about. And that could be that we use very simple language in some circumstances, really non-technical language, but also, through other channels, maybe systems and are explained in a lot more detail, through open source code, for example, and people that really care can go dig down. And I made the corollary with, science. There's journals that are open and publish the science, the peer review process. But then there's also more civil society and media, science communicators that use different languages, and really that multi-pronged approach is needed. The last thing we talked about was the role of institutions in the ecosystem, and that there's trust built through institutions themselves, whether they're government or not. So think of universities, or think of think tanks or organizations like DIAC and the SEO Strategy Council. So having these organizations be part of the discussion, it was seen, I think, by everybody to be part of the solution. And the last thing I'll say was one of our people had a really good example, is that when a technical problem or a technical solution comes out in the world, the first thing parents do is run and ask their kids, or run and ask their tech friend about, how does this work? And I think the role of the networks and role of experts in this domain, or speaking openly and being available, is a big part of the answer as well. So it was a privilege to talk to everybody.
Fantastic. That's wonderful. Thank you. So I think Rob I think we are out of time. But I feel like I want to have like another hour-long conversation. There's so much that's come out of this. So thank you very much, everybody. And thank you to Pyro and Eric in particular and Michael for joining us.